In this daily drop, we're going to continue down the rabbit hole of Apple log, LUTs, etc. that I started in the last episode of the daily drop. So let's go. All right, it's past 8 p.m. on a Sunday night, and it is time to actually get this episode done. I have been down this rabbit hole pretty far now, since even finishing the last episode of the Daily Drop. And if you haven't seen that, I'll put a link to it in the description. It's the previous episode last Friday, where I really get into some of the findings in terms of what I was discovering when using Apple Log, Apple's camera app, which is the native one in iOS, and also the new BlackMagic Camera App, which had some surprising results. Nothing really wrong with the recording of the image, but monitoring an image using the LUT that I could find on Apple's developer's site, which relates to Apple Log, yielded some strange monitoring or viewing LUT results, which could make things tricky. I put a link to a LUT that you could download that somebody else created to help solve this problem, but I've now gone down that road a little bit further. So what I want to do is head over to here and talk about some of the things that I've discovered. We'll get through all of that, and then there'll be a .zip file in the description for you to download if you so choose, which may help you when monitoring not only right now with the current problem with BlackMagic's camera app, but maybe, we don't know, useful for how you expose and how you want to treat your images in the future. I will put a disclaimer here right now before I jump into this. I am not providing these LUTs for anything but monitoring or viewing. So at your own risk, at your own decision to use these for something else, I am not a LUT developer. I'm not a LUT expert. I'm just trying to create some things here that maybe will help you in production a little bit more and in post a little bit more to get the results you're trying to get from using Apple Log. All right, let's go. Okay, this is going to be geeky, but I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible. So stick with me. And I know that I'm in Final Cut Pro here, but do know that this discussion really applies to other NLEs as well, such as Premiere Pro and DaVinci Resolve, because of the things we're going to discuss having to do with Apple Log and LUTs using Apple Log. So this is a clip from the last episode. This is in the BlackMagic, or shot on the BlackMagic Camera App at 350 ISO. Just as a base reference, manual controls, 24 frames per second, 180-degree shutter, so on and so forth. And this is just the Apple Log footage. No LUT applied at all. So I'm going to go over here, and when you bring this into Final Cut Pro, by default, it recognizes the incoming footage, and it applies a LUT, or lookup table, to it. And the thing to understand about a lookup table is it's dumb. It's not stupid, but it's dumb in the sense that it's not intelligent enough to say, footage is coming in that's overexposed or underexposed, and I'm going to correct the exposure so that we have a starting point with correct exposure. That's not how LUTs work. They're mathematical formulas that have to do with contrast and hue and saturation. So in theory, when you apply a particular LUT to footage that was exposed correctly in production, and I'm just showing you other LUTs applied to Apple Log just so you can sort of see what happens. What happens is you should be in the ballpark of correct exposure. But if you overexpose or underexpose your image and you apply that same LUT, you're going to get a different result. An example of that is, here's footage that I shot today. It is not a full stop brighter than the other footage, but it was shot at 500 ISO. A stop would be about 700 in the BlackMagic Camera App. And if I apply Apple Log to that footage, and then we go over here and we look at it over with the original footage, you'll see the exposure is different. Same camera, same basic settings, just a different ISO. We're looking at the same exact LUT. So The problem that we're trying to solve when we use LUTs is trying to see something that's close to what we may wind up with in our finished graded image. But it helps us and the client in terms of looking at something in terms of where highlights are falling and where midtones and, lift, gamma, gain. So if you look at the BlackMagic Camera App right now, as of today, which will be October 2nd or later if you're watching this, the first, or we'll say the second build of it that supports now Apple Log is not able to properly show you with a LUT what the image is going to look like. It's just greatly overexposing the image with the LUT, and you start to look like a clown or something like that. So this Apple Log camera LUT here is not something that I think any of us have access to. And it's frustrating because if you go into the package contents for Final Cut Pro, there is a file in there that may be this particular camera LUT. It's a 3D LUT, which is a .3D LUT file. If you change the suffix to .3DL, it says it's a luster file or created in. I don't know if that's true. But either way, you can't bring it into something like Lattice and actually start to work with it. So I've tried. So the next best thing, which again now relates to Premiere Pro and to DaVinci Resolve as well as Final Cut Pro, is on Apple's developer site. They have a Apple Log to Rec 709 LUT that you can download. But if you read the description, it essentially says that this LUT is designed for an ACES workflow. Well, that's a Pandora's box or a rabbit hole to go down. But essentially, it's the one that we have access to that relates to Apple Log footage and LUTing Apple Log footage. Sure, you could use one of these other ones as a starting point if you wanted to, but this is the one that is available from Apple. And look at our image. Our image is considerably different than what we would see if we're using Apple Log Camera LUT. The waveform says a lot in terms of what it's doing to the image. If I switch that over to the vector scope and we looked at that, we could see that between the two, it's also considerably different. So it's not exactly the same. I have a feeling that this Apple Log Camera LUT is converting this to what we call legal range, which is a more reduced range than full range. I'm not exactly sure that it's doing that. But what I wanted to do is, in addition to the LUT that I linked to on the last episode, is I took the Apple Log to Rec 709 LUT and I created both full range and legal range versions of those rated at minus stops or fractions thereof. So you'll see that there's the base stop of full range, and that's no different than the one that I downloaded from the developer site. But there are different versions here. There's a minus 0.5, a minus 1, a minus 1.25, a minus 1.5, and a minus 2 stop. So if I were in BlackMagic's camera app and I wanted to take a look at the footage and sort of get a sense of it being properly exposed, I might apply this minus 1.5 stop and use that as my monitoring or my viewing LUT. That's not necessarily the starting point that I would use in post-production. I might go ahead and use instead a minus 1 stop. And that might be my starting point. And I'm going to switch over here to the waveform monitor again so you can see that. And that might be where I start to adjust. Or I might find that I want to sort of be even a little bit more exposed than that. So I'll go over here and I'll say I want to do a minus 0.5 stop. And that's my starting point. And then I would go in and start to make some adjustments to my image. Maybe I would go ahead and take my shadows and bring those down a little bit, or change my black point. We generally want to be adjusting the image down, not up. But, here I can go in and add some saturation, reduce that, whatever I'm going to do, or you can go into your color wheels, so on and so forth, in terms of making adjustments to your image. But again, the frustration is that we don't have access to Apple Log, which I think is a better starting point for the image you're trying to adjust. Now let's go over here to the footage that's more exposed from today. And if I go in there, there's Apple Log. I can see that I could very easily use this as a starting point. No LUT, Apple Log, go in here. Let's say we go into color adjustments and I start to change my overall black point of the image, and I'm bringing my highlights down a little bit to sort of more around where they should be, and we start to adjust that. And you know, you can mess with your overall exposure, you can start to play around with your saturation. Again, I think that Apple Log is more of a legal range from what I can tell, though I'm not an expert in that, so I can't say for sure. But then I could also go in here and I could take one of these different LUTs here, and let's say I go -1 stop, and we compare that to Apple Log. This is without any adjustments, by the way. And you can see they're considerably different, but they're not too far off. I think there's more highlight information in Apple Log and more data in there from what I can tell with this particular LUT. But what you can do is you can download these LUTs and you can use them as viewing or monitoring LUTs in things like BlackMagic Camera. It's also not unusual to use a workflow like this when you want to purposely overexpose your image in production. It's been done for a long time with Sony mirrorless cameras, and also sometimes when you're using something called Cine EI or exposure index with cameras like the FS7, FS7 Mark II, the FX6, the FX9. And those cameras, while you might be capturing in, let's say, 2000 ISO, you may need to monitor at an exposure because you're basically capturing at a higher exposure and hopefully not clipping your highlights. And then what you want to do is monitor with something at a lower stop value. And that may even be your starting point for a LUT in post. Now, I'm not recommending you use these LUTs as a starting point in post-production. These are really just monitor/viewing LUTs. Use them at your own risk and try them out. But you do have, again, full range and legal range versions of these at different stop values. And hopefully they will be useful to you in not only Final Cut Pro with things like BlackMagic Camera, but also DaVinci Resolve and Premiere Pro. And you're going to have to start to find where you want to expose Apple Log. And you may find that you want to expose it a little bit higher or to the right on the histogram or to the top of a waveform monitor without clipping your highlights. So you are, in fact, ideally adjusting your image down when you get into post-production. So normally that grade card for me, without a LUT applied, would sit somewhere between, usually for me, about 40 to 50 IRE. But if you can see when you're in production that you're not clipping your highlights and things are sort of in a range, you might overexpose that grade card a little bit higher. You might, expose your highlights a little bit higher and then adjust that image down in post-production. So hopefully that's helpful. It's a lot to unpack. It's a lot to unpack for me too, because I'm not an expert in this. But a big shout out to the people at Video Village who develop an app called Lattice. This is the app that I was able to use to create these. They were kind enough to extend a timed version for me to use to create these as an educator. So again, thank you so much to the people at Video Village. And, Lattice is a very, very powerful utility or program that lets you open or create LUTs. And in this case, allowed me, and I barely scratched the surface, allowed me to take this base LUT that I was able to download and create both full range and legal versions at different stop values because all of those settings are inside of there. You can even convert 3D LUTs to 1D LUTs, 1D LUTs to 3D LUTs, and so much more that goes well beyond my mental capacity. But once these were converted, then I was able to load these up into Final Cut Pro onto the BlackMagic Design Camera App, and I've tested them in both. They work. Again, I still like Apple Log a little bit more as a baseline, but you can have these if you want. You can try them out and see if they work for your workflows, and there you have it. So there you have it. That is where I wound up with Apple Log and LUTs and things like that. Don't forget to check the description and download that .zip file if you so choose. It may be handy for some of the stuff that you're doing, especially if right now you're using the BlackMagic Design Camera App. And don't forget to, and I'll see you on the next episode of The Daily Drop.